And Paul, I don't have your CV right in front of me right now. I had a nice thing by Kent. Would you share? And I've got it here, but I don't want to pull it up and try to work through that in a heartbeat. So would you please introduce yourself and your background, Paul?
Oh, currently I'm a professor at the Faculty of Medicine at McGill, and in the past I started my. I, I'm trained as a physicist, and I did graduate studies with a research institute in power engineering, basically, and in the physics of corona discharges and things like that. But then I worked on a large project on electrical burns funded by the power utilities. And after that, I became a consultant to telecommunications companies on the issue of electromagnetic field health effects. Currently, I am the vice chair of the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Radiation. And this is the pulpit from where I prefer to speak at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What I'd like to do, Kent and Paul, is actually turn it over to you guys to discuss and explain what we're facing. Um, Kay in particular has been taking many phone calls from around the state and actually around the states, the United States, with people having issues. And we've really heard some very extreme stories. People that have literally been driven from their homes over the installation of a smart meter or a cell tower. And I'm pretty horrified at everything that I'm hearing. I admit to being kind of a newbie. It was on my radar as a thing of interest, but not as a thing of litigation interest until last year. But at this point, no, we are looking at numerous potential actions around particularly the state of Ohio. But we've also, like I said, we're open to discussing issues with other people from other states as well. So I'm going to take Jensen and I off a spotlight and leave this to you guys for a second, if that's okay.
All right, and as you do that, I would like to introduce Pam Wallace, who's with us here. She's a member or part of the Environmental Health Trust, and she can kind of fill in some areas, particularly along the legal and ordinance aspect of it. So it's really great to have you here, Pam, because I know that from past experience that you do a wonderful job of explaining things that Paula and I might forget. So I have prepared a presentation which I normally give. Paul, I don't know if you have one also, but I was thinking I could go through my slides, and as I do so, I encourage you and Pam to chime in if you see something that looks like it would be appropriate to chime in about. So the couple of things here that before I start out, before I start off any of these presentations is to let you know that I'm not anti-technology at all, nor is Paul, nor is Pam. Very much pro-technology, but I just want to make sure that that technology is being used safely, and it's not right now. So and another thing, which is good news, and that is we all love our smartphones. Mine is here right now. It's near me. I have it in airplane mode, but using Wi-Fi calling. The bottom line, and this is a theme throughout my presentation, is that if we will simply acknowledge the harms of wireless radiation, whether it's from our cell phones or from our smart meters, then we can do something about it. But right now, industry is saying, nope, absolutely harmless. We don't need to do anything. And the reason they say that is, well, you guessed it. It's about money. It would cost them a substantial amount in terms of their profits to do things right in terms of protecting us. So, Paul, in terms of, and or Pam, in terms of an introduction, a starting point, how's that sound? And should I move on?
Well, I just want to comment on something you said, Kent. I think that the big problem is that industry is extremely fearful. In other words, you're looking at a rat in a corner, and they're going to fight very hard because they don't want to lift the corner of the cloth on this problem, because they have no idea where it will lead. In other words, industry does what it does well, either power or communications, but they don't have a real expertise in relation to the health effects of electromagnetic radiation. So their fear is that if they admit to anything, they are opening up a Pandora's box. And unfortunately, this situation is contaminating any debate or any possibility of debate on this subject.
Perfectly said, and absolutely true. So let me get into my presentation. And Pam, Paul, stop me at any point. And actually, if there are questions, pressing questions, please let me know that from people in the audience. So starting off, the first thing that you probably want to know is about wireless radiation, what creates it, what are the relative risks, and what is it that I need to know about wireless radiation? How harmful is it? And I'll let you know what my perspective is. And I want to reinforce that perspective. Both Paul and I served on this New Hampshire State Commission that I'm going to be talking about. And it was an impartial commission, as I'll be pointing out. It had the expertise to answer the questions that were asked of us, and the same questions that you probably have in your mind. And I'm hopeful that when you walk away, you'll understand what the risks are, what the problem is, what the relative risk is. Also, how are the wireless radiation guidelines set? When you talk to people from industry, they claim that, oh, your exposure is only, less than 1% of the FCC limits. Well, what does that mean? How are the limits set? And are those limits really protective? And then it comes about why? Well, and because what you'll be seeing is that those limits, those radiation guidelines, are not sufficiently protective. And so your immediate question is, why isn't our government protecting us? And I think I can answer that pretty well too. And then relevant information about smart meters. I'm not going to be able to get a chance to go into the weeds, except for perhaps in Q&A. Both Paul, Pam, and I can answer some detailed questions, but right now I'm trying to give you a basic overview of what the harms are and what the concerns are. And then we have an opportunity to go into questions and answers. So one of the first questions that the commission was asked, or that we had to address, is that what is this wireless radiation? What are we being asked to look at? In the beginning, we were asked to look at 5G, but as we found out, it wasn't just 5G, it was all wireless devices. And you're looking at just an example there. In fact, surprisingly, what's not shown on this slide are smart meters. But except that they are IoT, Internet of Things devices. So there are just so many things that we are exposed to in our day-to-day lives, and smart meters are just one of them. And what you'll be seeing in this presentation is that as overall background radiation levels increase, well, we're going to be harmed by them more and more. So we want to lower that exposure to any of these devices if we can. I'm working with you now through a wired computer, as is Pam's got a wired computer, and Paul, I'm just assuming you have a wired computer as well. So this is what causes the radiation, and in there is our smart meters, and smart meters are significant sources of wireless radiation, and I'll be talking more about that in a moment.
Can I bust in and just a minute?
Please do.
Just a foundational piece, because oftentimes when people hear this, Kent and Paul are not going to be suggesting that we go back to the Stone Ages. What we're talking about is taking a look at the technology as it is, today, and how to make it safer. So we understand that we're keeping us in the age that we are, we're progressing forward, but we're taking the steps that we need to take in order to make this safer for people, biologically and environmentally.
Thanks for saying that, Pam. In terms of the commission that Paul and I served on.
Sorry?
Oh, yeah.
In terms of the smart meters, usually the way those are presented to the public is just a little dribble of data once in a while. But technically, it's not that way for all sorts of reasons. So there's a distance between what telcos present as an image and what happens in practice.
And I do have that image, and I'll be showing that in a little bit, Paul. I just want to talk about the commission that you and I served on, Paul, and that is, and why was it formed? Well, it turns out that legislators were being told by their constituents that, hey, we're being harmed by wireless radiation, and yet they were being told, these same legislators were being told by telecom and other providers of wireless devices that no, you need to expand your capability in this area. And so what do you do if you're a legislator? You're dealing with thousands of pieces of legislation and you've got this complex issue coming up. How do you resolve it? Well, what they did is they formed a commission. It was no small deal. They had to get legislation in place. And by the way, I'm going to make these slides available. And as you get these slides, you can click on the hyperlinks and it'll bring you to, in this case, the example of the legislation that formed the commission we served on. So it was passed by both houses of the legislature, signed by the governor, and it ended up with a commission of 13 members, and we had backgrounds that included medicine, physics, toxicology, electromagnetics, epidemiology, as you see on the slide. We had the expertise to answer the questions that were being asked of us. And they're pretty obvious questions, like, well, why does the insurance company or do in the insurance industry recognize wireless radiation as a risk, but won't insure for damages caused by that? That's a pretty big red flag, I would say. Even Lloyd's of London won't insure against it. And so why have there been hundreds, many hundreds of peer-reviewed studies showing harm from wireless radiation, and they have been ignored by the Federal Communications Commission? And I'll talk more about the FCC later. And why are the FCC guidelines based solely on thermal effects? In other words, I think we all know that if you put something in a microwave oven, that's radiation, that's wireless radiation frequencies, it'll warm up. And what the industry is claiming is that is the only harm created by wireless radiation. And it's not. It's other long-term effects, which I'll show later. And then why did the World Health Organization classify wireless radiation as a possible carcinogen, along the same things as DDT? And that's also ignored by the FCC in setting their guidelines. So the sources of information that we went through in the commission that Paul and I served on was, as you might expect, peer-reviewed and commission-vetted publications. And the reason I'm saying this second part about commission-vetted is that I think we all know that not all peer-reviewed journals are accurate. They can be swayed by misinformation and all that. But so we had to do our own vetting process. And I won't go into detail about that unless you want to later on in the Q&A session. But what we did in that vetting process is we ensured that the only articles that we used to draw our conclusions were from quality journals. We weren't dealing with any fringe journals at all. Regulatory agencies. We invited the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency. We invited them to come meet with us as a formal state commission, but even though we invited them, they didn't come to meet with us, and they really didn't answer our questions. So you might say, well, why are you including that in sources of information for the findings of the commission? Well, the fact that these agencies, these government agencies in charge of regulating radiation exposure, they didn't show up. That in itself is information, and very important information. We also brought in outside experts. We brought in 9 outside experts, and all of them, except for one, provided clear evidence that wireless radiation poses a risk, and they were able to show us data supporting that. But the presenter who did not acknowledge that risk, and it was the one who was paid for by the telecommunications industry. So the only person paid to present, everybody else was a volunteer. So the only one that was paid to come and say that there was not a problem was the person brought in by the telecom industry. Now, I'm not saying this to necessarily vilify people, but just to give you a sense of the landscape. That as you hear from people from the wireless industry, they're getting paid. Whereas we weren't paid to be on the commission, but they were paid to come tell us that there was no problem, nothing to see here, folks. Whereas in fact, there was quite a bit to see, as I'll be pointing out in just a moment. So the outcome of the peer-reviewed literature, and we identified, as I mentioned earlier, hundreds of top-tier publications showing harm from low-level wireless radiation exposure. Hundreds, top-tier journals. And the vast majority of them, not a minority of them, the vast majority showed that there was an effect from exposure. And I'll say a little bit more about what the mechanism was. But these two bullets right here are very important to see, particularly if you expect to be listening to people from the telecom industry or from, the smart meter industry who tell you that there's no harm associated with wireless radiation. And they also make the claim that the only peer-reviewed publications that show harm from wireless radiation are those that are cherry-picked from fringe journals. So the first bullet is that no, they're not fringe journals. The second bullet is no, we didn't have to do cherry picking. And in fact, in one study of the most important harm mechanism, that is oxidative stress, over 90% of the studies showed that issue existed. And that is oxidative stress, which you may have heard of before. Oxidative stress leads to free radicals. I had my blueberries this morning to drive down my free radicals in my body and vitamin C also, because we know that having too many free radicals in your body can lead to other diseases. For example, oxidative stress can lead to the chronic diseases that I have on the next slide, and lead to other diseases that aren't even shown on the slide. So that's what we found in just an overview, one slide showing of the outcome of our peer-reviewed literature study.
I just want to comment, Kent,
oh, yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Paul.
On the peer-reviewed publications. I'm old enough that I was a witness when IEEE compiled its own review of the literature. And I have to say that this was a very carefully guarded process, because obviously the engineering community has its own philosophy and views on this subject, and it needed to come to a predetermined conclusion. So it was not exactly what I would say a very open process. It was controlled by a few individuals. Now, Henry Lai, in my opinion, he's a man who's been doing this for many, many years. I think he's been doing this honestly, and his compilations are very, very impressive. But it's possible that industry will claim that Henry Lai's compilations are non-valid. So there will be some discussion. I mean, if I were a lawyer for the other side, as you know, they challenge every ingredient in your arguments.
Right. Thank you, Paul. So moving along, just oxidative stress is associated with exposure to wireless fields. No, that's us. It's independent of the type of radiator, whether it's your baby monitor, your cell phone, or a smart meter. So that causes oxidative stress, and as pointed out here in the last bullet, that can lead to a host of chronic diseases, such as what's shown right here. So what I've done on this slide is I've listed some diseases or issues that are associated with exposure to wireless radiation. This first one, if you take a sample of sperm, divide it into two test tubes, and you expose one to wireless radiation, and you don't expose the other to wireless radiation, there will be a difference in motility. In fact, what's been exposed to wireless radiation will be less motile and less effective, less virile as sperm. And if you go down this list right here, I was only able to come up with one, I only was able to provide one link for each of these. But once you get these slides, you can click on them and see that there is an association between exposure to wireless radiation and the neurodegenerative diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chromosomal damage. And you may, as you look at this, will say, well, if this is indeed the case, wouldn't you expect to see a rise in these particular diseases over time, particularly since cell phones and other wireless devices were introduced? And the answer is yes. So I'm going to take you through a few slides, and I don't want to dwell on them too much. But what these next few slides show is what's been happening with some of these diseases over the last 25 years. So let's move forward with that and look what's happened with deaths from Alzheimer's disease. As you can see here, it is more than doubled since 2000. And so where did I get this data? Is this something that I got off an extremist website? No, I went to the Alzheimer's Foundation to get this information. So yeah, something's going on with Alzheimer's. And you can see in the last slide, it's up there with something, neurodegenerative diseases that are associated with exposure to wireless radiation. Next one, diabetes. Look at 2004. Yeah, not all that much going on with diabetes, well, relatively speaking. Go to 2012. Yeah, it's been markedly increasing. What happened between 2004 and 2012? I'll give you a hint. That's when the iPhone came out in 2007. And then what has continued to happen is you see an increasing rate of diabetes. Am I saying that it's caused by wireless radiation? No, not necessarily. It could, but one thing I'm very confident of is exposure to wireless radiation does exacerbate the problem for reasons that we can talk about later, such as a breakdown in the blood-brain barrier, allowing toxins into the brain. Let's look at another one, and that is, this is from the Danish Cancer Registry, and it is tumors of the central nervous system and in the brain. And man, that's a huge increase since the year 1995. It's kind of moving along, or going along a level. And then around 2005, you start seeing an increase, and a significant increase. I should point out that these aren't necessarily gliomas, but they are tumors. And some of those could be non-malignant tumors. And you might say, oh, that's nothing to worry about. Well, the answer is, yes, you do have to worry about them because non-cancerous tumors can kill you. And then the last one I'll leave you with, and this is the view from 40,000 feet, is this one right here, which shows what's going on with Parkinson's disease. A couple of my friends have gotten Parkinson's disease, and as you can see, there's this very sharp increase. And again, Parkinson's disease has been associated with exposure to wireless radiation. So what has increased over that time period between roughly 2000 and today? Well, let's look at the network density in the United States back in 2004. You had trouble getting a signal on your cell phone, and there wasn't a lot going on in terms of cellular infrastructure. Go ahead to 2008, and my gosh, there's been a huge increase in the network density between 2004 and 2008. Move forward again to 2012, and then finally, we get up to 2018. Look at the density there. You would have a real problem escaping wireless radiation exposure. Okay, so that's kind of like the overview. Something's going on. Absolutely. I'm only claiming that wireless radiation is part of what's going on. There are probably other things going on as well. But let's look at more specifically what happens in the laboratory. What the laboratory studies show us? And so we go to this study right here, and you can read about it. It was done in 12 scientific institutions in 7 different countries. And that's one reason I'm showing it. It just gives you a lot of reason to believe that it's true. It wasn't something that just some podunk university came up with. And so this is what you're looking at is something like electrophoresis. It's called COMET assay. And if you take DNA and you don't do anything to it, this is what it should look like. It's nice and symmetric. It's the control. And then if you take that same or a similar piece of DNA and you expose it to ionizing gamma radiation, it's a very powerful form of radiation, which we know is harmful, you get a spreading of the DNA, of the trace. And this is the equivalent to, as you can see here, 1,600 chest X-rays. Okay, so what happens when you take something and you expose it to, well, like a cell phone, 24-hour exposure to a mobile phone, and the details are given right here. Well, you're seeing the same type of smearing, if you will, that's a technical term, of the trace, which means that you're also getting DNA damage by exposure. Okay, so we've seen the view from 40,000 feet with the trends in health cases, health situations. We've seen something from the laboratory. What does this mean practically? How could it affect you? And I'm going to show an example with a cell tower, but it's not dissimilar from what you might see for having a smart meter put on your house or near your house, or one that's pointing into your living space. And this takes us...
Before you leave the space on on the Comet test, you know, Henry Lai demonstrated that there was damage to DNA, both from ELF and radio frequencies. And the reaction of industry to that was to say that the Comet test is not a good test. You know?
Well, yeah, well, that's what they say to anything that shows that there's harm. They say, oh, there's nothing.
In
to
other
see
words, when
here.
they don't like the data, they attack the technique. Well, the Comet test is an established test in biology, and it's more difficult to perform. You need better experimenters than for micronuclei, for example. But it is still one of the gold standards in this area of genotoxicity. So beware that the industry goes to extremes sometimes when it tries to defend itself.
Absolutely. Thanks for adding that, Paul. So, so I said I would be showing you what it looks like, personally on the ground. Here's what it looks like. So this is something that happened back in California in around 2004. Somebody thought it'd be a good idea to put cell towers in and around fire stations. Yeah, it does make sense from an engineering perspective, assuming that wireless radiation is harmless. And so what the cell industry did is they put these towers on, as you can see in the picture, or near the fire stations. And one reason in particular, I like this example is that this has to do with firefighters. And we think of firefighters as being physically robust and probably being the least likely to complain about something. I think both that's true. And so let's look at what happened when they turned the cell towers on. So they had these cell towers, they put them up, and they turned them on, and here's what happened. And it's worth reading. Within a week of installation, many firefighters developed unusual symptoms of headaches, fatigue, insomnia, memory loss, confusion, nausea, and weakness. After a time, firefighters in stations with adjacent cell towers were found to have forgotten CPR or became lost responding to a fire in a city they grew up in. And again, you can get more detail by clicking on that link there. And so here are these very robust, physically robust people, not likely to complain, and they're now starting to complain about these issues. Now, you could look at some of those symptoms and say, well, gosh, headaches, well, maybe I drank too much the night before. Insomnia, well, maybe I had too much coffee. Memory loss, well, we all get foggy from time to time, and that's true. It's not necessarily that exposure to wireless radiation is causing these in every case, but it may be, and it happens in a lot of cases. And so if you are experiencing these things or a loved one, you might try experimenting by turning off electronic devices, including your phone, at night to make sure you get a good night's sleep without being exposed. And if you can lower your radiation other times of day, that would be a good thing to do also. But what this came up with and what the result was in California is they were able to, the firefighters union, to prevent having installations like that made at other facilities. This did happen in the first case that I'm mentioning. It happened to all of the firefighters, but in other cases, it happened only to a percentage of them. But still a significant number, because some people tend to be more sensitive to wireless radiation than others. And this is an extreme, or their reaction was fairly extreme. As I mentioned, not everybody's going to have this extreme reaction. However, what's important to know is that everybody who's exposed, anybody that's exposed, will experience oxidative stress, which does lead to things like premature aging and the diseases I showed on a previous slide. A question you can ask is this consistent with what you'd see in a laboratory? The answer is yes. And if you get this and you click on the link, it'll take you to an article that describes what exposure to wireless radiation can look like. Okay, so we looked at a particular case, and this, by the way, firefighters have fought this around the nation, but it has been really effective in California, and now they have a ban on putting these facilities on or near fire stations. And other states, as I mentioned, are successful with it also. So let's look at something else. Again, it's a relationship between health and exposure to wireless radiation. And this comes from a study done in Brazil. And you can see the title is pretty descriptive. It looks at death rates from cancer versus distance people lived from a cell tower transmitter. And this happened in Brazil. You can read the whole article if you want to. And it explored that relationship between cancer mortality rates and the distance people live from a cell tower. And this was gotten from government records, and so, government databases. So they were able to find out, when people, if somebody died of cancer, where did they live with respect to a cell tower? So it's a pretty neat study in that way. And of course, whenever you do a study of this type, you want to have a large number of things, a large N. And in this case, as you can see, that they looked at over 7,000 cancer deaths for people living around over 800 towers. So you have a large N in this case, which gives you, some confidence that you're going to be looking at the phenomenon in question. And it's something else that's important to mention, and another reason I like this study is it happened between 1996 and 2006. And the reason that's important is that in that time interval, very few people in this part of Brazil owned their own cell phones. In fact, it was until 2010 that only 28% of the people had them. So the reason I feel that's important is now we're looking only at the effect of the cell tower and not of people's own personal electronics. Something else worth mentioning, which will make sense later on, is that in this study that looked at lots of cell towers and lots of cancer deaths, all the exposures were less than 5% of the FCC guidelines, which I'll be talking about shortly. So the results of this study can be shown clearly in one slide, the next slide. And I'll be going over that here. And this is the x-axis represents the distance that somebody lived from a cell tower. And it goes from 100 meters to 1,000 meters, which is, a kilometer. And what you have on the y-axis is the rate of death per 10,000 people from cancer. And so the blue line here represents the cancer death rate for the population in general. And what you see on the red line is for people participating in the study who lived within a kilometer of a cell tower. Now, the result here is pretty easy to interpret, and that is the closer you live to a cell tower, the more likely you are to die of cancer. And so if you have a cell tower next to you, well, that's not good. But if you have another strong radiating device, like a smart meter, your odds of dying from cancer are increased compared to somebody who doesn't have a radiating device near it. So this is very important in a finding. And it's not like this is a one-off, that it only happened once that somebody did a study like this. Somebody did what's called a meta-study. So a meta-study is where you take previous studies looking at the same thing and you combine the results together to come up with a greater degree of confidence in the results that you found. So you can look at that study, read it if you want to, but it's showing that basically by living that you have very bad health outcomes, negative health outcomes as a result of living near a cell tower. But you could also translate that into living near a smart meter. And what does come up, time after time in these meetings, in these these studies, is that 500 meters is a reasonable distance to, in terms of living near a cell tower. Now, we could come up with some similar setback distance for smart meters, but we haven't done that yet. We need more information. So you may also be saying, well, what's going on? Isn't this pretty severe or important information for us to know about? And who's weighing in on this? It's very important. Why aren't we reading about this in the daily papers? Why isn't this headline news? And the answer is, who owns, who are some of the major contributors, who are some of the major advertisers in news outlets? Who owns some of them? Well, it's going to be the telecom industry. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And so where do you get good information? Well, it's oftentimes by physicians. Many physicians, as you can see on this slide, are quite aware of what's going on here. And they describe it as a public health crisis. You don't hear about it because the news media has been told to stand down regarding this issue. So here's perhaps one of the most important slides you need to see, and that is how the current guidelines were set by the FCC for the exposures you're getting from, well, cell towers, your cell phones, and smart meters. And this was set back in the 1980s, and it's based on short-term studies around an hour. So right now, these are the the guidelines, the exposure guidelines that are being used for us 24/7, 365. And yet the studies to come up with those levels what happened with experiments lasting an hour or less. And they were done on animals. They were behavioral studies on 8 rats and 5 monkeys. That was the beginning. They have done follow-on studies, but they came up with the same results, which didn't change the numbers. Now, what they assumed here was only heating effects, and I mentioned that earlier. Your microwave oven heats you, if you were to stick your head in a microwave oven, which I don't recommend doing, and that clearly would be an acute effect. But in the long term, wireless radiation is going to be harmful. And it's that long-term effect that we're interested in here. And so the way this study went that determined the thresholds, the guidelines, is they took these 8 rats and 5 monkeys separately. They had been food deprived, yet these rats and monkeys had been trained to push a lever to get food. And so what they did is they put them in a cage. They were food deprived, as I mentioned. They started ramping up the electromagnetic exposure, the wireless radiation exposure, until the animals could no longer press the lever to get food. So that was the behavioral aspect of it. They couldn't function anymore. Some of the monkeys had burns on their faces from the high exposure rates. And so when they got to that point where they could no longer function, they referred to that as the threshold dose for radiation exposure. And then they came up with a totally arbitrary, what they called safety factor. They didn't look at relative risk or anything like that. They just, if we divide this number by this exposure value by 50, that should be good enough for the population in general for 24/7 exposure. And then for workers, it was only a factor of 10 that they divided that very high threshold dose. So I think you can see, and I hope that it comes across that I'm appalled, and I remain appalled. Every time I present this, I'm appalled at what they did. But just as a quick recap, and the reason I recap it is usually people go back and they say, no, that couldn't be right what you told us. Well, what I told you on the previous slide is right, and recapping it, studies, the FCC guidelines that you'll hear about from people from telecom or from the smart meter companies, they'll say, you're well within these guidelines. Well, here's what the guidelines were from. They were set from studies lasting an hour or less, single endpoint attributed to heating. And that one endpoint, by the way, anybody involved with experimental studies like these, epidemiology, toxicology, know that you look at multiple outcomes. Paul is an expert on that. He could talk to us for the rest of the day on this if he wanted to. But you should know that this is not what you do for a legitimate epidemiological study. They only looked at a single endpoint. Small number of animals, my gosh, 8 rats, 5 monkeys, that's not a very big number. And an arbitrary safety factor. I could go on and on about that, as could Paul, about why that's, you can't just apply whatever number you want to come up with the answer you want. So what they did was kind of equivalent to saying, okay, everybody here, let's smoke a pack of cigarettes within an hour's period of time. And if you all live, well, then we'll declare this as being safe. Well, that would be ridiculous. But that's essentially what they did in setting these values. I would like to make a point. Actually, it's going to be several points here. And that is, let's look at what happens with long-term exposure. Because I was saying that there's a problem with short-term exposure and determining limits based on short-term exposures. But what you're looking at right here is a study. This is a study that is continuing, I understand, and they looked at hundreds of trees operating near cell towers. So here in this case is the cell tower, and then you go 465 feet away, and back in 2008, when they started the study, the tree looks pretty healthy. You go fast forward another 7 years, and oh my gosh, the tree's starting to look not so good on the side facing the tower. You go up another 3 years, 4 years, and you're seeing that the tree is degraded to the point where it had to be cut down. Now, some things to point out here is that the exposures, look at, I don't know if you can read this on the slide, but we're talking about a very small percentage of the FCC limit, 0.03% of the FCC limit on the left side of the tree. And you can see that clearly there's been degradation. So the reason I feel this is important is to point out that your cell phone is not like a death ray that you can aim at somebody and they'll keel over dead. Not at all. But it's something that if you expose something or any living thing to over a period of time, it's going to have a negative impact. So when you have a smart meter in your home, that's going to have a negative impact. So how do our exposure limits compare to other countries? Well, you can see that we're up there with Japan. A lot of countries just say, well, it's good enough for the United States, it's good enough for us. And that is the case certainly for Japan. But a lot of countries do have far lower exposure rates. And there's a question sometimes about how well they enforce those exposure levels, exposure guidelines. But clearly, we don't compare well with other countries that seem to, well, have more realistic exposure levels that really do a better job of protecting their people. Now, at this point, you say, okay, this is pretty crazy. How could that be? We do have this FCC that's supposed to protect us. What's going on with them? Why aren't they protecting us? Remember, we invited the FCC to come meet with us in the commission. They just didn't show up. Well, why didn't they show up? Well, this is a report. It's not from some extremist website. It's from the Harvard Center for Ethics website. And you can easily access, just click on the link. And it makes for good and interesting reading because it shows you what's going on in government right now with captured agencies. And so, the title alone tells what's going on. Captured agency, how the Federal Communications Commission is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates. And that's what's been going on. It's referred to as industry capture. And the picture on this image is a revolving door. So people like Tom Wheeler going from being the head of the CTIA, Cellular Telecommunications Industries Association. So that's the industry trade group, to being the head of the FCC and then back. So these same guys keep going through the revolving door and they set standards that are really beneficial for industry's profits.
If I may note, Kent,
Yeah.
The FCC has no indigenous medical or health expertise.
Great point.
I mean, they couldn't really come in front of a commission and argue. And actually, the FDA is responsible for it because they are the ones who ordered the NTP study, but they are under very heavy political influence. So it's a matter of agencies pointing, the finger at each other, avoiding the problem.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, yeah, and thank you for that, Paul. So I'm assuming I'm going to the right slide. Here we go. I'm not going to go into detail about what the Harvard report talks about, except that they do give reference to the amount of money involved. So they have a budget of over $100 million per year for lobbying and campaign contributions and all that. So it's just what Big Tobacco did. Well, for those of you who may not remember what Big Tobacco did, well, you got things like this. Cigarettes do not cause cancer. I mean, you can always find somebody to support your case when you have enough money. And this was an actual ad. And actually, here's something to point out. It's important to point out. You know that 1 out of 6 smokers, only 1 out of 6 full lifetime smokers gets lung cancer. And so have we really proven that smoking causes cancer? Well, we know that it does. And it's just that how long does it take before you can accumulate enough data to make that statement definitively? I have a number of friends from high school who smoked, and they said, well, whenever they prove that smoking causes cancer, well, I'll stop. Well, they didn't, and they're all dead now. because it does cause cancer and it causes other health effects. So I just wanted to point that out. And this is, part of what the industry is able to do, this multi-trillion dollar industry, arguably the highest profit industry on this planet, what they're able to do with money. And we've seen it before. We don't need to see it again. So we'd like to say some things about these smart meters, how they work, and why they don't simply put out radiate, or they don't radiate 6 times a day as some industry people will claim. And what you're looking at is which we referred to as a mesh network. And that is if your house, and let's look here at case 1, where you're able to communicate directly with the neighborhood utility pole that has a collector unit on it. So now your smart meter is able to connect directly to this collector. The collector then will communicate to the tower, and it goes to the utility. Okay, then you'll have a certain amount of radiation per day from that. But what oftentimes happens is that you have a house that can't communicate, it's too far away to connect directly to the connector, the collector. And so what it does is it goes through an intermediate house. This one right here that I'm pointing at, I'm assuming you can see my cursor. So it goes to this house in case 2, and then case 2, that it will communicate both the information from both sites, from 3, as you can see here, 3 houses directly to the collector. And so it's going to be sending a lot more data than if you have a single connector. So these mesh networks are used a lot, and what they mean is you're going to have a lot more radiation than if you're able to enjoy single connection to the network. You're still going to be getting a lot more than the 6 radiation spikes per day, but I'll show you what that looks like also. So here there are the daily pulses that you get from a smart meter. And it's hardly, 6 of them per day. You're getting strong doses of radiation with each of these pulses. And so I don't want to go into the details and the nuances of this time domain plot. The takeaway is that you're getting a lot of exposure. In this case, as you can see, over 12,000 pulses per day, not 6 pulses per day, but a lot more than that. I don't know, Paul, if you want to comment on that. This will depend on the amount of information that is chosen for your particular facility.
Yes, well, once an engineer has a device in your home and it's connected to your power, you're paying for the power for transmission, why not transmit a lot of data? In other words, if it was just a monthly single pulse, for the total of kilowatt hours consumed during that month, it would be a minor thing. But engineers are very practical people. Once the system is installed, why not take advantage of it? Why not transmit temperature, pressure, whatever, sound, all sorts of things like that? Handshakes from the receiver to the receptor, alarm signals, exceptional, maintenance signals. So engineers were not told that the radiation had any health impacts. So they use the resource that they have to their fullest.
And well said, and that's exactly right. So we were never told as engineers, I'm an engineer, as I think you can guess, and we were never told when we were designing these devices to keep radiation low. No, radiation is harmless. Why keep it low? Well, the bottom line is that we now know that it's harmful. We've actually known it for a long, long time. And so why bother keeping the radiation low? You have this unit now, send all the information you want. Other things, and just it kind of backs up, it tells you something similar to what you saw on the last slide. And that is if you're looking at a smart meter at 8 feet, and this is just to give you a sense of the amount of radiation that comes out of a smart meter and the frequency with which that comes. And these are not small amounts of radiation. These peaks are very intense. I will give you some comparison. That if you're talking about what you get from your cell phone, that can vary between a few milliwatts, or actually, what is it? Paul, do you remember the lower? It's kind of slipped my mind. Oh, 0.6 watts, 600 milliwatts, as I believe for the iPhone, the lower power. So it varies between 0.6 watts and 3 watts. That's a powerful transmitter, as that example. And so what you're getting from your smart meter is 1 watt, but it's pretty continuous, as you can see. So it's radiating a lot of the time. With your cell phone, it's something you can turn off, but with your smart meter, you can't. And on the New Hampshire Commission, we considered that to be a very important factor. And that is when we're talking about cell towers, when we're talking about smart meters, you want the citizen to be able to say what type of exposure they're getting. In other words, you want them to have the ability to turn off radiation if they no longer wish to be exposed. Kind of like your ability to control your safety in a vehicle. If you choose to use your seat belts, or you want to, buy a car that has better safety devices, that's your choice as a citizen. We want you to have the same choice. We wanted you to have the same choice in the commission with wireless exposure. If you want to live in an area where there's low exposure, you can turn off your own electronic devices, you're not going to be experiencing a great deal of exposure unless you have a smart meter in your home. You don't have any choice then, or unless you have a cell tower nearby. So that's where we were coming from in the commission, and that has to do with the slide that we were looking at, is that if you have one of these devices mandated on your property, on your house, you can't control it. And just some more
Can I
value.
say one quick
Oh,
thing
please
there?
do, Pam.
Oftentimes, again, this is a simplistic comment, but oftentimes we're not just talking about one smart meter. We're talking a smart electric, smart gas, smart water meter, and so this is a cumulative effect.
And if you're in an apartment building, you might have an array of them. And that's where they really become problematic. I mean, they're problematic when you put one of them on the house of somebody who's sensitive. But if you start getting an array of them in an apartment building, they can be really harmful. There is a multiplicative effect that we can talk about later. So going back to the slides, and again, I'm not going to dwell on this information, but we can go into greater detail about it, about the peaks that you get, the peaks of power you get from a smart meter or a smart device compared to other devices. It's a very high rating, high value. So the conclusions reached by the New Hampshire Commission, you have it right here. It's a 490-page report. You can get the gist of it from just reading the first 20 pages or so. Most of it or much of it is appendices. And the basic conclusion is wireless radiation poses a significant threat to human health and the environment, regardless of what's creating that wireless radiation. And this, which has been traditionally called electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS, is real. Some people, and an increasing percentage of the population, are being affected by EHS. So a few things I need to say about that is what we've been talking about, this radiation, wireless radiation, is a form of pollution. Some people call it electropollution, and that's a good name for it. And so what we've been seeing in the country is that over the years, the level of background wireless radiation has been increasing. So just like if you have asthma or emphysema and you're in a low air pollution situation, not a lot of people are going to be expressing symptoms. But as you increase air pollution, then more and more people are going to exhibit the symptoms of emphysema and asthma. And that's what's happening in this country is as you add new facilities of any type, whether it's for communications or for your smart meter, you're raising the background level of wireless radiation, and more people are going to exhibit the symptoms of electromagnetic hypersensitivity. There is a good solution, and I didn't have a chance really to hit on the solutions very much, but there are a lot of them, and we can talk about that later. But one, and probably the best solution, is going with fiber optics. There's no reason why you can't run fiber optics to your smart meter. If you did that, you would eliminate radiation completely. And so that is the preferred solution. It makes the initial installation a little bit harder because you have to now run the fiber optic to it. But once you've done that, you're set. And you're going to use lower energy, have it be more secure. And we can talk about security issues later if you'd like to. So there are just a lot of good things associated with using fiber optics to connect your smart devices, all of them, to whatever they need to get connected to, usually the internet. And once they're connected to the internet, well, you're set. You don't need to then go back and revisit it. Finally, and Paul, you were on the commission, so you can back me up on this. Our conclusion is this, all of this that we're talking about today, it's not a scientific issue. The science is crystal clear. Wireless radiation causes harm. We know how it causes harm. We know a lot about the degree to which it causes harm. But that's not the issue here. It's political and it's economic. So that concludes my basic overview of the findings of the New Hampshire Commission. So I'll sign off here and leave it to Paul and Pam, or I'm not going to sign off, but I'll turn off my slide and just see what questions, comments people might have.
And I'm going to chime in just for a moment to say that I did put some resources in the chat from the Environmental
Thank you.
Health Trust that tell us a little bit about how we can interact with our technology more safely. Again, you know, that is the lens in which we're looking at this through, and it's an important lens because we are with this technology. It's not going anywhere, so we're hoping to point in the direction of more safety. We want to give you the tools to, you know, that you can take to be more safe at this time, and then the brilliant minds like Paul's and Kent's that actually do the engineering pieces that tell us actually how to take the steps on a greater level to get more safer with our technology. So check out the chat if you'd like to find some more things you can do in your personal lives. And again, this information isn't really to alarm us. It is and it isn't. We are living with this. We're just, again, trying to make you aware and allowing for some conversation on how we can do things a little bit more safely. So I'll turn that to Paul because he has more important things to say than I.
No.
Well, we're all worried about experiencing discomfort from radiation, as the electrosensitive do. We're all worried about the chronic diseases that could be associated with this radiation, but there are also other things that are very worrisome in the sense that, Pam, I think you know that in schools, when you install Wi-Fi devices, there's sort of a change in behavior in the children. And we know that in rats, for example, the radiation has been shown to impair their performance in running mazes. Essentially, they are less functional. We also know that radiation is associated with anatomical changes within the brains of these animals. So my impression is that if you're exposed to electromagnetic radiation substantially, maybe ultimately your IQ, your functional IQ is affected now. Kent has taken wisely some blueberries this morning in order to protect himself. But I would not be surprised if we could demonstrate that learning ability is slightly impaired by electromagnetic radiation. So you're going to tell me, well, the psychologist at the conference was asked, how bad is it to have a loss of 1 IQ point? And his answer was very simple. If it's your kid, it doesn't matter. But if it's my kid, it's very, very important. But going back to history here, you know, the Roman Empire was very much affected by exposure to lead. And of course, the rumor is that the leadership was probably more affected than the general population, but it is the activities of mining for the extraction of silver that overall increased the exposure to lead in the Roman population. And that probably resulted in a loss of 2 or 3 IQ points. So 2 or 3 IQ points is not very, very much. And is it possible that lead led to the downfall of the Roman Empire? So what are we doing with radiation today? You know, are we engaging in something that is very, very subtle, that is unhealthy, but that we will acknowledge a little bit too late? As some very wise biochemists say, don't play with your basic metabolism because it is very dangerous to do so. And that's exactly what electromagnetic radiation does.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Paul. So is now the time that we would want to entertain questions from the audience?
And that's what I was going to jump in. Thank you all very much for coming on today, giving us your precious time. I know you're all busy. If we were in person, I'm pretty sure we'd be clapping right now for the presentation. So I appreciate it. I know everyone else does. We'll do a short question and answer session, and then we'll get on to, I'll have a couple things to say. Then we'll get on to Jason from Ohio Stands Up here. So I will try to moderate this the best that I can, but if anyone would like to just start asking a question, go right ahead. Christopher Smith, even though I'm guessing that's not Christopher. Let me unmute you there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for today, by the way. I really appreciate the information. We have a product that we purchased from a holistic practitioner, which is called a Total Shield. I don't know if any of you have heard about it or not, but it's a product that takes the ELF, electromagnetic waves that come into your property or your home, and they turn them into a different type of wave. I can't explain it entirely, but it's supposed to deflect the electromagnetic radiation coming in from like the towers that are around your homes. Have any of you heard of that product before?
I've never heard of it myself. There are a lot of devices, and we oftentimes are asked to weigh in on them. To the best of my knowledge, there's no good product except for a full body shield. Like Pam, I believe that you have one of these. There are tents made of conductive material, and they're not cheap, but they can be effective against the higher frequencies, but not the lower frequencies. Pam, do you care to comment?
Yes, I mean, I think that there's a lot of question about this, and frankly, most of the products have not been researched, and I'm sure maybe Paul and Kent can give a little more information should we need to go in that direction. But what we don't want is people to get a false sense of security, because it
Right.
impacts life in very, very prominent ways. In addition to the bigger health concerns that have been brought out, some of the things that people are experiencing daily, like Kent had referred to, insomnia, tinnitus, heart palpitations, headaches, that people aren't relating to the fact that they're sleeping by a smart meter or they have their cell phone and they're using that as their alarm clock. And as soon as you make small adjustments to those facts, or there's a distance, that's your friend, you see some of those things resolve. And so we're really trying to tie, so that people start to understand that they could be having impacts. So most of those products are not researched. There are shielding fabrics and things. And because I do have a sensitivity to this, I actually need to, I did buy a tent. I've tested it thoroughly. It does attenuate and keep the frequencies low. So when I travel, I can go to a hotel room, because it's very difficult to find hotel rooms that don't have routers in close proximities, or Airbnbs. And so in order for me to be able to continue to travel, I have to make these levels of modification. But in your own life, it's going to be important to pay attention to the things that we do know reduce exposures. Not to say don't use the products, but I wouldn't rely on them with the
Right.
reliance that we hope to, because it seems like a good solution and it may turn out to be, but we're not there in our understanding of that yet. And I don't know if Paul and Kent want to weigh in on that. So if people are interested in the tent, I think maybe what I'll say there is, from our understanding, our body rejuvenates while we sleep. And part of the issue with this is that the pulsation that happens from these emissions, they get in the way of the body doing that. And so that's one of the reasons we see some of the biological effects. So if you can pay close attention to your bedroom and having lower, basically lower levels in your bedroom, that can go a long way. So I'll put a link to the tent that I have. They are not inexpensive. People do sleep in them. I don't in my home. I make the modifications to have low levels in my room, but I do take it going when I travel, which requires a little explanation when I go to families' homes.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Me, and this is my tent. So anyway, I'll put that in the chat.
So the little stickers that you can put on the back of your phone that are supposed to help, are those just junk science too?
They
You
may
have to
not be, but we don't know.
You should trust the products that reduce the radiation. So my recommendation, get a meter, and verify what you're doing. You have to understand that any risk of that sort creates a rich market for things that do not work,
Right.
are essentially placebos. So any solution that you pay any amount of money for should reduce the radiation where you are.
Okay. Thank you.
Right, thank you. You've got a question in the chat. It's fine, okay. Does it help if meters are at the street rather than in the house?
The classic answer to that is distance is your friend. And so if your meter is far away from where you live and for where you're going to be, then yeah, it makes a big difference. I don't know if you want to add to that, Paul or Pam, but basically the farther away, the better.
So how do we stop these schools from putting towers on their properties?
Great question. Glad you asked. And that is one thing that Pam has been very involved with is working with municipalities to put proper ordinances in place that say, no, you can't do this. You can't put towers next to schools. And she's been very successful at this. Environmental Health Trust has been successful at this. And actually, Pam, if you wouldn't, it would be so kind as to put the link to the ordinances that are on the EHT website. And there are just examples of how municipalities have put these ordinances into practice so that you can't have a cell tower or other radiating devices near schools.
In the state of California, you're
Thank you,
not
Pam.
allowed to have schools near power lines or power lines near schools. So this is a question that has been tackled a little bit earlier. It's just that we don't have statewide legislation in the states to prevent these installations because industry has been so enthusiastic about sprinkling them everywhere.
Oh, yeah. I live in Huron County and I can name 4 schools right now that have them on their property.
Oh, yeah. Well, they target schools. In fact, I could, and in fact, maybe now's the time to talk about the incentive. Why does telecom do this? Why are they pushing so hard to roll out so many facilities when most of us know that we're getting great connectivity to begin with? Well, part of the answer is they want to replace your internet provider, your ISP, internet service provider, your cable guy. And how they're going to do that is put these 5G towers everywhere so that every home is able to access the internet via 5G. And then they'll they, the companies, will be selling you these 5G home internet. Or do you have them in your area? Is that what they call it, 5G home internet? Well, you go to your, for example,
5G.
huh?
I just know it's 5G.
Okay, so what they do is the companies like Verizon will say, okay, come buy this cute little box. It's got one plug on it. So you take it home, you plug that one plug in, and voila, you have Wi-Fi in your home. You don't have to deal with your cable provider anymore. Well, that could be good. They're selling it at a very low cost because they're willing to, it's called a loss leader. They're doing it below their cost to make it look financially attractive. But then what are they going to do? They now have you're connecting to the internet through them entirely through the 5G network. That's one reason they need to roll it out, because they can't roll out this approach until they have sufficient infrastructure in place. That's why they're pushing so hard. So what's the cheapest way to get infrastructure or provide the coverage right away? Well, it's to go to the center of populated areas, like where schools exist. That's where they cite schools in the center of population areas, high population areas. They put up a tower, turn up the power so that they can get maximum coverage. They go up to the maximum allowable limit. That is the cheapest way for them to get coverage. Now, there are a lot of easier ways to, or I shouldn't say easier, certainly not cheaper, but there are better ways of doing this. And I'm saying this as an RF engineer, as a radio frequency engineer. Yeah, you can there are lots of, in almost every case, there are lots of places or ways you can site a tower that's not going to be right on top of, high population areas, but it's going to provide great coverage.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. I think what we're gonna do here, there's some questions popping up in the chat, but I think I can answer some of those. They might be more geared toward me. And just because we're short on time here, we need to get to a couple other things. Thank you very much to everyone, to the experts that appeared today, Paul, Kent, and Pam. Is there anything you'd like to say before we move on to another speaker here? Well, we really do appreciate your time, and for any questions maybe that we didn't get to, I can compile a list of those, and maybe we can get those over to you, or some way get those answered.
All right. Sounds good to me.
Okay, well, please stay on if you like, but if you guys are busy, we understand. I think we're gonna, I'm just gonna speak about opt-out provisions here in Ohio for a little bit here.
All right. I'll sign
Okay.
off and I'll see you all later. And again, you know how to reach us. So you will be getting a copy of the slides. And those slides contain hyperlinks that you can use to find out where we got the information.
Yep, and I'll say one thing before I go. If you are interested in taking on the issue of cell towers near your schools and in your municipalities, please contact us at the Environmental Health Trust. I will put my email in the chat. So we do work with communities and teach them how to go about having a pretty comprehensive conversation with their school districts and with their municipalities. So we're happy to work in partnership with you to make something like that happen. So I'll put my email in the chat. And good luck to you. Know that there's a lot of good work being done on this, and thankfully you have a good team of people you're working with to make some positive change happen in your area.
You know, so I'd like to respond to something in the chat, and that is, are we able and available to do town halls? I'm an Ohio guy. I got my degree from Ohio University, and my wife is from Cleveland, you know, Independence. And so it'd be a good excuse to get back in the area. So yeah, we do. We just have to arrange it ahead of time.
All right, thank you all very much. It's greatly appreciated you were here today.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. So I just wanted to, and I see Jennifer has her hand raised. Just real quick, Jennifer, what was your question?
I had a quick question for Pam. I was just wondering which tent she has. Is it the Mercola tent?
I think she just signed off, but do you have access to the chat?
Yeah, I didn't see the name of it in the chat. Did she
Okay.
say?
I will have to go back through and look. I could certainly maybe reach out to her and get you that information.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So I'll just quickly go on because I'd like to get to Jason from Ohio Stands Up. So we're, you've heard about the health effects, and we didn't even talk about, possible, reasons to think these aren't secure with the information they transmit, and some possible other issues. But so what are our solutions? Well, political is one of them. And I think some people in Cuyahoga Falls and some other spots in Ohio, Streetsboro, have gone to city council meetings, talked to their mayor. That hasn't worked, at least as far as I know, but they could, or it could, that tactic could work if you catch it ahead of time. A lot of these things were in the works for years ago. I think in Cuyahoga Falls, the ordinance to install these smart meters citywide was probably 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So once the locomotive gets moving, it's pretty hard to stop it. But if you figure out your town is starting to do this, you can, voice your opposition to your local officials. So I will always recommend that. The other thing is call your state legislatures too. I've reached out to a few of them. I've had some positive response, but not a lot has happened there, which is disappointing because in other states, either at their state regulatory level or at their legislator, they actually have an opt-out provision in many states, whether it's electric or water or anything. In Ohio, we only have one opt-out provision, and that's in the Administrative Code of Ohio. I don't have the section right off, but we could share that in the group chat here. But basically that opt-out is only for public utilities, which is kind of confusing. What that means is First Energy, AEP, things like that, Toledo Edison. That's not if your municipality is your electric provider. So for instance, Cuyahoga Falls, they provide the water and the electric, but because they're a municipal provider, there's no opt-out. But if you do have First Energy or AEP, any other ones, they do have to provide you an opt-out. So if you don't want it, they are not allowed to install it. And if you have it installed, I believe they need to take it out. What they will do in exchange for that, though, is charge you whatever their fees would be per month, 30, 50 bucks, whatever it's going to be. So you do have that. Now, there's no gas opt-out and no water opt-out that I've found. So after that, you get into legal solutions, and that's what we've kind of done. I don't want to go too far into it without getting to Jason first. But if those political tactics don't work, like they have in other states here in Ohio, or whatever the reason they haven't, you're just left with legal options. And I'm gonna go ahead and just pause recording so Jason can just talk about what's happening, just kind of a case study here in Cuyahoga Falls, and then I'll kind of weigh in.